thanks so much for joining us,
It's
Nicola.
an absolute pleasure.
Welcome to the New Statesman podcast studio.
Thank you.
The latest poll ahead of the Holyrood elections next year finds the SNP ahead, but Labour and Reform tied in second place. Could you reflect on this apparent rise in support for reform in Scotland? I know that we're only going by polls at the moment, but it's interesting.
So I think we are seeing Reform do much better in Scotland than I think anybody might have expected just a few months ago. They're doing relatively less well in Scotland than they are in England, but I don't think that's any room for complacency. The reason for that, though, is I think the SNP is still managing to appeal to people and address people's concerns in Scotland in a way that Labour is clearly not managing to do in England. And in Scotland, Labour is, it seems to me, still a million miles away from persuading people that they might be a potential government. And I think, Keir Starmer's performance over the last year will not have helped with that. But, why is Reform doing better? They are tapping into very real concerns that people have. People are really struggling just now. Living standards, the state of public services, a sense that, things in the country as a whole are not I'm talking the UK here, are not working as well as they should do. And they are tapping into that, exploiting that, making hay out of that. And I think what is needed in response to that is, from parties on the progressive left, is a recognition of these problems, a recognition they need to be addressed, but a better analysis of the causes of the problems and better solutions than Nigel Farage and Reform are offering. Nigel Farage wants everybody to believe that all of the ills of the country are down to immigrants and wokery in summary, and that's nonsense. The problems of the country probably date to the financial crash, exacerbated by Brexit, which Nigel Farage was one of the key drivers of, obviously. So parties on the left need to offer the real tangible solutions that are going to convince people that they can make their lives better. And if that is done effectively, communicated well, I believe Farage can be seen off. But at the moment, he is being allowed to set the agenda and shape the narrative far too easily, in my view.
Mm-hmm. And in Scotland, as in England, you've seen protests outside hotels housing asylum seekers. And you've also seen misinformation about the 12-year-old girl in Dundee allegedly brandishing weapons, which was a source of a false story spread really widely online, shared by Elon Musk, that she'd been harassed by migrants. I mean, you talk about the parties of the progressive left having an answer to these kind of, strategies by parties like Reform. What should the SNP government be doing to respond to these kind of trends in Scotland?
I think the SNP, and obviously I'm an SNP politician, so I'm going to say this, but I think objectively, and you can see this reflected in the polls, the SNP is doing much more than any other party to respond to these real challenges. Very tangible things. Just a few weeks ago, abolishing peak rail fares in Scotland, slashing the cost of commuting, for example. The Scottish Child Payment, lifting children out of poverty. So child poverty in Scotland is falling, it's rising elsewhere in the UK. These are tangible things. Secondly, the SNP is probably alone amongst mainstream parties in the UK in arguing the positive case for immigration. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are debates to be had about the appropriate levels of immigration, about making sure the immigration and asylum system work better than they have done up until now. But the SNP is actually making the case for immigration on a positive basis. That people who come from other countries, we need them because of our own demographics, doing important jobs, contributing to the health and diversity of our country. And I think that is one of the fundamental points I would make. To my mind, Keir Starmer is legitimising Nigel Farage's main argument by effectively saying, we agree, it's all down to immigration. But trust us, we'll deal with it better. If you say to voters, effectively, I know he's not saying this explicitly, but if you say effectively, Nigel Farage is right on immigration, then don't expect people to vote for you, the party that they believe has failed on these things. They're going to vote for Nigel Farage. So there needs to be, firstly, a taking on of the arguments, because many of them are based on misinformation, and misinformation is a huge threat to the health of democracy right now. Based on misinformation, based on distorted reality. So take on the arguments from a position of principle, but then offer solutions that are better than the ones, the snake oil that Farage is offering. Farage is part of the sort of society that is more responsible for some of these problems. Driver of Brexit, so many of the problems that the UK is suffering right now stem from Brexit. He doesn't want people to look at, the yawning gap between the richest and the poorest in this country. It suits him for people to think, no, it's all the immigrants' fault, or it's all the fault of the gay person or the minority, or, if you're a young working class guy who's struggling to get on in life, well, it's all because women's rights have gone too far. People like Farage here, Trump in America, those kinds of politicians the world over prefer to scapegoat people because it takes the attention away from where the real problems are coming from.
Okay, and there's been a great deal of coverage in England about these St George's crosses going up on lampposts and being painted on roundabouts around the country. And the same has been happening with saltires in parts of Scotland. Council workers trying to remove them, tasked with removing them, have even been intimidated in Aberdeenshire and Falkirk. What do you think the response to that should be? Because we've seen down here in England, Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper saying, I have England flags, fly the flag.
Yes. I mean, look, I've stood in front of saltires. I've, waved the saltire. I'm proud of the saltire. I'm a patriotic Scot. But I also think we should get less worked up about flags. Flags are, bits of fabric at the end of the day. They represent something about a country, but they don't have personalities of their own. A flag will be seen internationally as a positive thing if the reputation and the perception of the country is positive. It will be seen negatively if the reverse is true. I think we should all be worried a lot more right now about the state of public services, about people's living standards, about some of the real issues that people are confronting, about the state of democracy generally, than we should be concerned about flags. So my view is, let's not play into this. Let's not start to make flags, or I heard somebody, I think, from the reform side of the debate in the last few days talk about how we should be following America and making kids sing the national anthem in schools of a morning. That's all deflection, in my view. That is all designed to make people look away from the real problems and the real causes of these problems. So, the only people who benefit if we all get into a frenzy about flags, I commented in response to a question at the weekend. I was doing an event in Aberdeen and there were saltires on lampposts, something I've never really seen before. And it took me aback. But then I thought, well, why are we getting worked up about this? Just don't play into the hands of the people who want to stir up this kind of polarisation and toxicity in our communities.
Okay, because you've worked all your political life on a nationalist project, and I wonder whether
on an independence project, and I'm really not being pernickety there, but I do think it's, I've talked about this many times over the years.
Yeah.
The SNP is called the Scottish National Party. Of course, the Scottish independence movement is a nationalist in the sense that we want independence, but it's not nationalist in the way that these, nationalist movements that we see across the world, or even the one Nigel Farage is leading. We're a civic, inclusive, independent, self-government movement. Many of these nationalist movements that we talk about around the world, they're not about independence of countries because they're in countries that are already independent. My vision of an independent Scotland is a country where it doesn't matter where you come from. If you live in Scotland, you have as much say over its present and its future as somebody who can trace their generations back centuries. So I think there is an appreciable, marked, substantive difference between the Scottish independence movement and what we are seeing in other parts of the world.
Right, okay. So there's no way that you reflect on the fact that there's this unresolved debate over Scottish independence, which does put identity in contention somewhat, that perhaps could fuel, nationalism both sides of the border.
Look, I'm not saying that there's no, there's no supporters of Scottish independence who might, not come at that from a very different perspective than I do. Of course, it's a broad-based movement, but I think that's a minority. Nor am I saying, because it would be disingenuous for me to do so, that there's not a powerful sense of identity behind the Scottish independence movement. There's a strong, Scottish identity, Scottish patriotism, but it is founded in a sense, or the vast majority of it, the kind of mainstream of it, is founded and rooted in a real sense of internationalism, of Scotland also playing. The SNP is probably one of the most pro-European parties in the UK, and one of the most pro-immigration parties in the UK. And I think both those things are worth saying. There's also in this, this was the strong, driving theme of the Yes campaign in the 2014 referendum. It's not about independence as an end in itself, about, flags or passports or embassies. I'm not saying these things are not any part of it, but it's much more about using the powers of self-government to build a better country, a fairer, more equal, more prosperous country. So, there's a real onus on the shoulders of those of us who support Scottish independence always to, point out what makes it different from some of the nationalisms that people are seeing elsewhere.
Yeah.
I thought we'd probably got to a point where we didn't have to do that because everybody knew and understood that. But given the climate we live in today, I think there's probably a renewed need to constantly be talking up the civic, inclusive, open, welcoming, tolerant values that absolutely imbue the Scottish independence movement.
Right, okay. And I'm glad you mentioned the Yes campaign, because there's a part in your book where you write about your experience of a positive and good-natured contest over Scottish independence in 2014. And there are some people who remember it differently than that. Journalists, supporters particularly on the no side, feeling intimidated. There was online trolling, some nasty graffiti. Some see the Scottish referendum campaign as even a sort of ground zero for the uglier, polarised, populist kind of politics we saw come to a head during the Brexit campaign, fuelled by social media, and now we're almost seeing it more prominently than ever in the UK. I'm sure you dispute that characterisation, but do you reflect at all on some of the more divisive elements of that campaign?
Yeah, I reflect a lot on it. I mean, that wasn't my experience, but I accept my experience was my experience, and these things are both subjective and also, depend a little bit on where you stand. I mean, around the margins of the independence campaign, there was some, pretty horrible abuse, but on both sides. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think most people who were around in Scotland at that time, though, on either side would also speak about, an incredibly politically engaged population, including young people, including children, actually. There was, 85% plus turnout in that referendum. There was a sense of, a really energised and energising debate about the future of the country. I think the thing I reflect on, and I say it in the book, and I feel a bit ashamed that I didn't think more about this during the referendum itself. And I only really understood this, and I should have understood it before this point, but I only really understood it at a sort of visceral level during the Brexit campaign. Because in that campaign, I saw it as, standing to lose something that was important to me, European identity, citizenship. And that made me, in a way that I should have done earlier, but I didn't, really understand at a very emotional level that for people on the no side of the independence campaign, that's how that felt as well. They were standing to lose something, UK, being part of the UK, the Union, that mattered to them. So I do reflect on that, and I think, we all get caught up in campaigns and the things we believe in, and I think it's really important in politics to stand up for what you believe in, and it's particularly important just now. But equally, it's also politicians don't do, and I include myself in this, we don't do enough to put ourselves in the shoes of people on the other side of debates to us. And I think the world would probably be a better place and in a better shape right now if there was more of a conscious effort to see issues through the eyes of people on the other side to you.
Okay, thanks. And let's go back to the young Nicola who joined the SNP when you did. Why did you choose the SNP? At the time, they had a reputation as tartan Tories.
Yeah.
I mean, why did you go for them and not
I mean,
Labour?
that was already moving. So we did have a reputation as tartan Tories back then. Where I grew up, my mum and dad's house, the next door neighbour at the time, used to, every time the SNP was mentioned, go, bloody tartan Tories. So that was definitely the sort of image the party had back then, but it was changing. So in the SNP was kind of moving leftwards. Alex Salmond was in the ascendancy. There was a sense of, the SNP positioning itself much more firmly on the left of politics than it had ever happened before. At the same time, Labour was kind of starting its slightly rightwards or centrist shift under Neil Kinnock. So that was part of the reason. I was somebody that was motivated into politics by a sense of rage and injustice at what Thatcher was doing to the community I was growing up in. So that was, everything about my background would probably have said I would have joined Labour. But the move to the right of Labour, left to the SNP, was part of it. But the clincher really was the democratic deficit that led to my support for independence, because Thatcher was decimating communities like mine through her economic policies. Scotland already voted Labour, so Thatcher hadn't, been elected effectively by people in Scotland. And even to the teenage me, it was like, well, what's the point of voting Labour? Mm-hmm. Scotland already votes Labour, but they can't stop what is happening. And that's because it doesn't matter how Scotland votes. We get governments that are decided elsewhere. Ergo, if Scotland becomes independent, that's how that changes. So that's what took me into the SNP.
Right, okay. And when you stood for election in 1992, you were the youngest candidate in the UK. When you look back, do you wish you'd pursued other avenues before standing for election that time? I mean, do you see that as a sort of moment in your life that funneled you into a life in politics?
Totally funneled me, although I was probably already in that funnel before then. But it definitely, sort of cement. I don't know if I'm mixing my metaphors here. It kind of cemented me in that funnel. But there's part of me thinks if I hadn't stood then, I was 21, if I hadn't stood then, I would have developed a bit more as a person, and but then if I hadn't stood then, I might never have gone on to do all the things I've done. So I don't regret it. I'm glad I did. What I think looking back, and it's no point in some ways having these kind of regrets, and they're not really regrets, they're reflections. I think I wish I'd had the confidence to do what I did politically, but realised that I could lighten up a little bit and do other things along the way. And I guess many women will identify with this, many working class people, that whole imposter syndrome, that feeling that you just have to devote yourself and be so single-minded and committed to what you're doing in order to prove yourself was definitely something I had in spades. And if I could live my life again, which in many ways I'm glad I can, but if I could, I think that's the advice I would try to give to my younger self, who would tell me to F off, incidentally, which would be, do what you want to do and do it seriously and, work hard at it, but do some other things as well.
Right, okay. And was there ever a time that you thought about quitting? Because it took you 4 attempts to secure a seat.
So not back then. I think I had that attitude of, the thing is, remember back then the SNP was not the political success it is now. So, and there wasn't a Scottish Parliament back then either. So I went into politics and even into, standing for election with no real expectation that I was ever going to be a politician. So the defeats back then, they didn't make me think, I'm going to give up because I'm not achieving what I expected to achieve. I was, trying to argue a case and progress a cause more than I was trying to get elected, but I wasn't necessarily expecting it. I think when the Scottish Parliament came about and I was elected to it, at the end of the first term of the Parliament, I did think seriously of quitting because, partly the new institution had lots of teething problems. I, had suddenly achieved this thing of being an elected politician, didn't feel in those early years I was really, settling in or making the difference I wanted to. And so, I did have a period so that was round about 2003 of thinking, maybe this isn't for me after all. Then, kind of internal turbulence in the SNP kind of pulled me back in again.
Right, that's the thing.
And the rest is history, yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of the book is dedicated to your relationship with Alex Salmond, your predecessor. How much did he shape you as a politician?
Hugely. And I was really anxious in the book because of what happened later on in our relationship. I was really anxious that I didn't, because it would have been really easy, I think, to kind of rewrite history and try to say, well, he was always a wrong and didn't have any positive influence in my life. And that wouldn't be true, and it wouldn't be fair to him or to me. He had a huge influence on me. He, not entirely for altruistic reasons about me. He was trying to strengthen the SNP and, improve the kind of strength and depth of the SNP. Back then, people said we were a one-man band. Without him, there was nothing. So he was trying to bring on other people to show that that wasn't the case. And I was one of those that he encouraged. And so he gave me the confidence to do things that I wouldn't, left to my own devices, have had the confidence to do. And I learned so much from him. And then, we became this incredibly successful political partnership. So, he shaped me a lot. He helped me, develop a lot in ways that I might not have done otherwise, or certainly not done as quickly. So yeah, he had a very, very powerful and, for a large part of my life, positive influence on me.
Yeah, and he was a sort of dominant character, a big ego, and you characterise yourself as an introvert in your book. So I wonder, in that dynamic, was there a difficulty ever in standing up to him, or even sometimes feeling bullied by him?
So not me. I mean, this is really, I was doing another interview in the last few days, and the person who was interviewing me said, your relationship with Alex Salmond was really complex. And I was like, yes, that is actually true. It was very complex. He never bullied me, not in a way I would describe as bullying. I never had a difficulty standing up to him. We would have stand-up fights about things. And I was always seen as, by other colleagues, as the person who could stand up to him. And he would never kind of shout down in the way that he sometimes would with others. So, and we, in our heyday, when we were at our best, we complemented each other. So yeah, he was the big kind of dominant ego, very much an extrovert. I was an introvert, and that combination worked well. We compensated for each other's weaknesses, and so it worked really well. I think, even although I wouldn't say he bullied me or that I couldn't stand up to him, maybe that, later on became much more of a relationship of equals. But in the early days, it was very much, he was my mentor. I was, his pupil kind of thing. So I think there was within me always a sense that I kind of wanted his approval. I wanted to know that, I was performing in the way he thought I should and could. And so his approval mattered to me. And the converse of that is that at moments, even when I was First Minister, there were a few moments when I suddenly realised his disapproval could still really undermine my confidence. So I think that is the complexity of it.
Yeah, could you give an example of any of those moments?
Well, after the 2017 election, which was a really, of all the, I don't want to be boastful here, but I'm going to say anyway, of all the 8 elections that I led my party to victory in, the one I found most miserable, to be honest, and didn't perform well in a variety of reasons. I got the politics wrong. I wasn't particularly well during it, so it was a thoroughly miserable experience from beginning to end. Probably the only person who enjoyed that election less than I did would have been Theresa May. Yeah. And he lost his seat in that election, and he, we'd had a few kind of disagreements during the campaign, and he refused to speak to me for about 2 weeks afterwards. He just didn't answer my call, and that was one of the moments where I realised that I was trying to tell myself he was just being unreasonable, and I didn't care. I was the First Minister, I had loads to do, but I knew deep down inside actually it was really kind of getting to me that he was showing his disapproval in quite, as to be blunt, cruel a way.
Yeah. Yeah, and did you ever feel that your political life existed in his shadow at any point?
Yeah, in my younger days. But I don't think I'd ever have described it as that, to be honest, because in my younger days, I was in his shadow because I was junior to him. He was the leader. It was only in 2004 that I became his deputy. And so I would never have thought of it as being in his shadow. I would have thought, well, he's the guy I'm learning from, and, we're working together. I think later on, when I was his deputy, leader of the SNP, and also a few years later became deputy First Minister, it was, and actually originally by design, it was meant to be more of a co-leadership than a leader-deputy. He was initially in Westminster, I was leading the SNP in the Scottish Parliament. And so then, no, I didn't really feel in his shadow. And to be fair to him, he never tried to make me feel that I was in his shadow. He, apart from the moments I've been talking about where his disapproval undermined my confidence, more often than not, he was the one pushing me forward into the limelight rather than the reverse. So, the relationship, complex though it was, different personalities though we had, the flaws that, I had, the flaws that he definitely had as well, aside, the relationship was one that was hugely successful, and it worked really well until suddenly it didn't.
Yes, and you write about that breakdown of the relationship, and you write in the book that he admitted to you that the substance of one of these sexual harassment complaints had been true. And nevertheless, you write, in his efforts to turn himself into the wronged person, he demonstrated that nothing and no one was sacrosanct for him. There was never the merest hint of concern about the damage he did to the party he previously led. Indeed, it felt to me that he would have rather destroyed the SNP than see it succeed without him. Obviously, he's no longer around to answer for himself. How do you think he would have responded to this if he were alive, if he'd read this about himself?
I mean, as I say in the book, when he died, I thought really hard about whether I should just take all this stuff out. The reason I felt I couldn't and shouldn't is that, and this goes to how would he be responding, right up until the day he died, he was accusing me of being part of a conspiracy against him. Supporters of him still accuse me of that. There's rarely a week goes by in Scottish politics when somebody, speaking now on his behalf, doesn't make that accusation. So it was important to me, and I think important for the record, to set out the reality of that. If he was alive today, he'd be raging and, calling me all sorts and trying to destroy me the way, and to be blunt, the latter part of his life he was trying to do. And what still grieves me to this day about, the situation with him is that he was acquitted of all criminal charges, and I think it's always really important to say that. But in the course of his trial and what he said to me, it was very clear that he had behaved to women in ways that were not appropriate. And instead of just honestly reflecting on that, he decided to try to turn himself into the victim, because Alec was somebody who could never really admit fault. So, and even in, the excerpt you read out to me there, when he admitted to me, he gave me an account of one of the things he had been accused of, that to me was an effective admission. It was, but in his head it was still, no, it was all a misunderstanding, and this is outrageous that I'm being accused of this. He couldn't just say, you know what, yeah, I shouldn't have behaved like this. The world is changing, I need to change with it and reflect on all of that. And had he been able to do that, everything might have turned out differently. And this whole conspiracy thing came about as a way of him avoiding looking at himself honestly in the mirror. And he died without ever reckoning with himself. And I think that's probably my biggest regret in all of this, because I don't know whether he ever would have got to a point of that, but there was always the chance, and now, of course, there isn't.
And I've worked in political journalism for over a decade, and there's usually a whisper network about men who are alleged to have done certain things, powerful men. You hadn't heard. I mean, you say you hadn't heard about these things.
There was two things I knew or had heard about Alec. One we've talked about already, which I knew he could be a bit of a. I always hesitate to use the word bully. Maybe I shouldn't hesitate, but he could be really rough to work for, and he could be really rough on people. And I, on many occasions, intervened to try to calm situations like that down. The other thing I had heard was rumours of consensual affairs. I always took the view, rightly or wrongly, that unless, that was about to somehow, threaten the SNP, what we were doing, it was none of my business. What consenting adults get up to is nothing to do with anybody else. That's how I see it. But no, on the sense of inappropriate sexual behaviour, I hadn't. And, it always makes me raise a bit of a wry smile, since it all came to the fore, when people say, oh, well, you must have heard, you must have known, you must have seen something. Everybody did. Well, why did nobody else say anything? Because I don't remember you, whatever, usually, no disrespect, a journalist saying to me, how could you not have known? Well, did you know? Had you heard it? Because I didn't ever hear you say anything about it. So no, absolutely not. When the sexual, misconduct allegations came to light, I was utterly floored by them, and totally rocked to my core by it.
Okay. Let's move on to your time in office. I mean, you describe vividly an almost panic attack that you suffer over the Independence white paper when you're trying to pull that together. But, I mean, it struck me that there's a little less emotion over other domestic issues that were still very pressing during your your time as First Minister and continue on today. You know, the rise in Scotland's drug death rate, Glasgow, you know, where your patch was, having the highest drug death rate in the country, and Scotland's education performance falling behind England and the UK, the attainment gap, failing to eliminate that, and the ferry procurement scandal as well, costing the taxpayer hundreds of millions, and those costs still seem to be going up. I mean, when you reviewed Boris Johnson's autobiography for us, Unleashed, it was a great piece. You pointed out that maybe it's a feature of memoirs, but large chunks of it feel like a version of his time in office that he wanted to be true. Could you be accused of the same in your memoir?
Look, I will be accused of all sorts of things every day, and usually, you know, opposing things at the same time. So, look, you can't include everything, and there will always be a sort of judgment which different people will come to different conclusions around over what you do include and what you don't include. I think if you take the education and attainment gap, I talk a lot about that, and I think, as I do generally, reflect pretty openly on what I did and didn't get right. On drugs deaths, you know, I talk about with Boris Johnson actually trying to pursue with him what was a really important part of trying to tackle the drugs crisis in Scotland, which we now have as a safe consumption room in Glasgow. So I do, you know, talk about that. Ferries, look, people, you know, there's been endless coverage of the ferries. You know, since I stood down as First Minister, I've given evidence to Parliamentary Committee on that. There is no, you know, shortage of scrutiny and coverage. I needed to, I think, choose what I wanted to talk about to give an overview of my time in office, and that's what I've tried to do. I think the criticism would be fairer if I'd just talked about the things I thought had gone well and I hadn't talked about the things that hadn't gone well or that I got wrong. I've tried to be really open about, you know, the things that I didn't do as well as I should have done, or the things I made mistakes on. But, you know, people will come to their own views on whether I've included the right things or the wrong things.
Yeah, and in your time in office, did it feel more visceral, that fight to try and gain independence, more visceral than these kind of domestic issues that we're talking about?
No, and I would challenge the fact that I don't show emotion about these issues. I think I do. And for me, and this comes back to, I think, a core aspect of the independence debate. The independence debate is not over there and these other issues are over here. They're all integrally linked. You know, take drugs deaths, and I am not, and I should preface this, you know, for anybody listening, that I'm not somehow trying to pass the buck here. Really not. But it is an example of the difficulty in having kind of split responsibilities, some lying with Holyrood, some with Westminster. Drugs is effectively a reserved Westminster issue. Scotland has some ability to, but, you know, the safe consumption room, we needed Westminster consent. So independence is about equipping Scotland's Parliament with the powers to tackle these issues on a more holistic, comprehensive basis. So there's not that kind of division between independence and these really important issues. There's lots of things I wish I'd done better as First Minister, lots of things I wish I'd done differently as First Minister. But when I look back on my time in office, and again, this is not making an excuse, it's context. In my 8.5 years as First Minister, I had to fight 8 elections. I had to deal with 5 different Prime Ministers. There was a Brexit referendum. There was only 2 calendar years in which I didn't have to fight an election. One was 2018 and the second was 2020. Right. And of course in 2020 we had a global pandemic. So the point I'm making is that my period in office was not this calm period where I could just focus on, you know, business of government, normal business of government. There was always an election or a pandemic, and therefore it was really hard to get a sort of run at just straight. But even taking all of that into account, you know, we reformed the tax system, we set up a new welfare system, we doubled free education and childcare, we established the Scottish Child Payment, we established a state-owned national investment bank, which is powering the transition to net zero as we speak. We nationalised the railway. So huge amounts of things done that will stand the test of time, in my view. Things like the child payment, the doubling of early years education, the baby box. much derided by, opponents, but actually a really, really good thing. These things over time, I believe, will have a huge impact on the attainment gap in schools. Because if I made a mistake around that, or to save my critics the bother, I'm not saying it was my only mistake around this, but when I said I will abolish or eradicate the attainment gap in schools by, 2021 was what I said, I underappreciated at that moment that, that's about much more than what you do in schools. It's about child poverty. It's about the conditions young people are growing up in, and that takes time to turn around. So some of what my government did do will have that impact. Unfortunately, it will take longer for it to feed through than I was giving it taking sufficient account of.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And it's interesting because, after a difficult period for the SNP in recent history, it's now back at the top of the polls. Labour's losing support. I mean, is independence back on the cards for Scotland at any time soon, in your opinion? And what would the conditions need to be for the SNP government to demand another referendum?
I mean, again, this may fall into the category of she would say that, wouldn't she? But independence has never been off the agenda or off the cards. Opinion polls in Scotland, at a headline level, it's roughly 50-50. Yeah. Sometimes, yes, will be slightly above 50, sometimes slightly below. But that's roughly where it is. You look underneath the bonnet of opinion polls, though, and to the sort of age breakdown. Amongst younger people, support for independence is 60, 65, 70%. And, this whole kind of, sort of perceived wisdom of, well, okay, young people are much more radical when they're younger and then they get less so as they get older. You're not seeing that so the 16-year-old in 2014 who voted yes, now 26, 27, is still supporting independence. So that support is rising up the age. So there's a demographic kind of, trend towards independence. And I think Scotland will become independent. I think it will be sooner than it probably feels possible right now. And what are the conditions? I think, and this has always been the challenge for the independence movement, so it's not new, it's to just persuade enough people that independence is not this abstract thing. It's actually integral to the solutions that we need to some of the problems people are dealing with, and to ensuring that Scotland can reach its full potential as a country. And I think that is underway, and I think that will happen. I'm not going to sit here and put a timescale on it, because I think that would be, pointless to try to do. But well within my lifetime. Okay,
and you don't think it needs sort of like a majority of seats in the Holyrood elections next year?
But by definition, in order to get legislation for another referendum through the Scottish Parliament, you would need to have a majority to do that. So, kind of by definition, you need a majority. But you need to have, and this is the process. I remember going back to the earlier days with Alec and I. We used to reflect that. This is before 2014. That getting a referendum was going to be the easy bit. Winning it was going to be the really hard bit. I think that is the other way around now. Getting another referendum is going to be the hard bit, because I think Westminster knows in its gut that if Scotland gets another chance, it will probably vote yes. So they'll do their damnedest to avoid that ever happening. So getting the referendum is the hard bit. That's not to say I think winning it will be easy. It won't be. But I think the next time it will be won and Scotland will become independent. And I'd make this prediction at the end of the book, and who knows whether it's right or wrong. But I think there will be a rewiring of the relationships across the British Isles. I think it's not a decision for me. Some except my opinion doesn't matter. I think Ireland will unify. I think Wales will become more autonomous. And, the British Irish Council, which exists, I used to attend as First Minister, that potentially becomes a more powerful body, because it's still a body for collaboration between, the component parts of the British Isles. Just the nature of the relationships will have changed slightly. And you know what? Independence for Scotland also means independence for England. And greater self-government for England might not be a bad thing. I've got full confidence in England's ability to govern itself.
And where do you see yourself? I know it's a hypothetical question, but if you did manage, if the SNP managed to achieve that difficult task of another referendum, what would your role in it be, if anything?
I would be a very proud citizen of an independent Scotland.
Right, okay.
I don't know. My days in frontline politics are, coming to an end. I'm obviously still in Parliament just now. We'll step down next spring. The last couple of years have taught me a lot, but one of the things they've taught me is you can never really foresee what lies ahead in life. And so who knows, I would never say never to anything, but I don't see myself back in frontline politics. I would absolutely be in the thick of a referendum campaign, campaigning and arguing for Scotland to become independent. I would, be absolutely there to offer whatever I could to making the early days of an independent Scotland a success. But it's for the next generation to come up and lead to that charge.
And on to a different subject. I mean, looking back at gender recognition reform, in the book, you wonder whether you should have paused the legislation. What would you have done during that pause if you'd taken it, do you think?
So I think it would have been to see if we could find a way to, what was my objective? Trying to make life better for trans people without compromising, the rights of women. I've been a, campaigner for women's rights all my life, and I always will be. So could we get to that objective in a different way? I don't know if it would have worked. And actually, since, publishing the book and some of the reaction to that bit of it, I'm probably less convinced than I would have been earlier that it would have worked, because I just think so many people are so deeply entrenched on their own side of the argument and don't want to kind of understand it from the other side. And I'm that applies across the spectrum of this debate. I'm not saying it's one side only. So I don't know whether it would have worked, but maybe it would have been worth a try, because where we are right now is obviously not a place that I think is very good for anybody.
And you write about losing the dressing room when you couldn't answer that question of whether the double rapist initially sent to a female prison, who identified as a woman, was in fact a woman. And I've noticed in interviews that you've done about your book since then that you still don't have, a straightforward answer to that question.
Do you know what? I'll come back to that in a second, but just again for the record, because this gets lost so often. Isla Bryson, the prisoner in question, was not treated differently to the way in which trans prisoners have been treated for years and years and years. There was nothing in how Isla Bryson was treated that arose from the gender recognition legislation. The legislation wasn't on the statute book, so by definition it's still not in the statute book. Isla Bryson went to a women's prison to be assessed. That was the procedure then. And I think within a day, certainly 2 days at most, was in a male prison. And to the best of my knowledge is still in a male prison, which is exactly where they should be, because Isla Bryson is a rapist. That's the description that is most appropriate for Isla Bryson. On the question of, people want me to say Isla Bryson's a man, or I don't care about the feelings of Isla Bryson. I really don't. My answer to this is not about Isla Bryson, but this is a feature of where we are in the debate. What I know for certain is that what I say about Isla Bryson immediately gets transferred onto the entire trans community. And I am not going to, just to make my life easier in an interview, give that, because I don't want to be part of, even inadvertently, pouring more abuse down on the heads of the trans community. So I'm not going to get involved. Isla Bryson's a rapist and in a male prison, and that's as it should be. But the people who constantly ask me, say Isla Bryson's a man, say Isla Bryson's a man, it's not really about Isla Bryson. It's about then say, trans women are men. And it's about demonising and stigmatising the whole community. And I'm just not going to do it.
And I did wonder, actually, I mean, I was reading, JK Rowling did a review of your book on her website.
I don't know where she gets the time. I mean, she is a highly successful woman. And, I've bought Harry Potter books for all the young people in my life and, think they're great. But my goodness, where does she get the time to obsess about me? I hate to tell her it's just not reciprocated.
Right, okay. So you're not going to write any long reviews of the Harry Potter books at any point soon?
I just wonder sometimes if people who get so... I've got lots of things I believe really passionately, and I'll always stand up for what I believe in. I'll always fight my corner. I'll always defend myself against, unwarranted attacks. But at the end of the day, I don't obsess about other individuals who happen to have a different view about me. That they're entitled to have a different view, and I don't know. There are some people in this life who, and I've said this before, but it strikes me often, that spend an awful lot, like immeasurably so, an awful lot more time thinking about me than I ever spend thinking about them.
Yeah, and you do mention in your book about her wearing a T-shirt, Nicola Sturgeon, Destroyer of Women's Rights, and that was a turning point. You say made you feel more at possible risk. You two are arguably two of the most prominent Scottish public figures that there are, especially feminists, such prominent feminists, people that Scotland can be proud of in different ways. I wonder if you think that there's ever a chance of you coming together in the spirit of healing
I would have to say I think it looks really unlikely. But that's not from my perspective. Look, I have no great animus towards JK Rowling. I never have done. We disagreed vehemently on independence. Yeah. She was on the other side of the independence campaign, absolutely entitled to her view on that, as I am on mine. She has a different view to me, a very different view to me on trans rights. She's entitled to that. I wish she would argue her position without what appears to me sometimes indulging in a bit of gratuitous cruelty to trans people. And I really do wish that, but that's, she's got to make her own decisions there. But I have no animus towards her at all. But, we are where we are, and I will continue to stand up for what I believe in. But, to go to the T-shirt, that it seemed to me, she, and I don't agree with her on this, but she comes at this from a position of women's safety, of a debate that she thinks has got too much abuse in it and everything. And yet, for somebody in her position, instead of trying to, lower the temperature and, sort of ease the rhetoric, does something that is very much about doing the opposite and very personalised. Now, I was First Minister. Should have been subjected to scrutiny. But, we all have to take a bit of responsibility for how we go about arguing our case and for the rhetoric we use and for the way in which we do things. And, I say this just as a statement of fact. I don't live on a yacht. I don't, live behind big security gates. I don't have, I'm not surrounded by security. So if you are deliberately going to try and stir up venom towards somebody, you're entitled to do it, but don't try then and kid yourself that there's no potential consequences to that. And I think that should apply to everybody. I'm not singling out JK Rowling here. I'm just saying I think we've all got to recognise in the world we live in that words and actions can have consequences. So you're entitled. We live in a free country, despite what some people try to say. People are entitled to say what they want, but, don't then pretend that doesn't have potential consequences.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you mentioned sort of your life, your personal life. You don't live on a yacht. People saw images of your house looking like a crime scene, and you write about that in the book. I appreciate you can't get into the investigation into SNP finances. Your ex-husband, former SNP chief executive Peter Murrell, awaits trial for embezzlement. But I do wonder how you feel about those images of your house, your arrest, your ex-husband being charged. Do you worry about them sort of being part of the lasting memory of your leadership in the mind of some of the public?
I think I don't worry about it. That was an episode that was really difficult for me, and people will have different views on whether it was justified or not, and I'm not getting into that. It happened. I've come through it and I'm on the other side of it, but it was really, really difficult. There are people in Scotland who will, and again, I'm not saying this critically, I've been a high-profile public figure, this goes with the territory, who will always want to see the negative about me, who will want to and never want to see the other side. And there are other people who are the opposite, who will only want to see the positives. But no, I think people and particularly as time passes, we'll have a more rounded view. And, you know, the kind of promotion of the book over the last few weeks has been good for me in the sense that it's, I mean, you know, there's been so much support, and I've done so many events with people coming along to, you know, be really positive, and sometimes I think we get caught up in the whole kind of social media, you know, toxic debate, and just forget that from the majority of people out there are actually reasonable and fair-minded, and, you know, have different views on different politicians, but are not driven by this kind of hate and venom that a tiny minority are.
Right, okay. And much of the media coverage actually around this book has been on the subject of your sexuality, as you write that you've never considered your sexuality as binary. I'm not going to ask you the same questions that you've been asked about that, but I do wonder why you think there was such an obsession with your sexuality and rumours during your political career.
I have no idea. It made me laugh at times and kind of frustrated me at other times. It wasn't because the rumours were about sexuality, it's because the rumours were not true. You know, there was a time, I mean, just before COVID, and then it kind of reactivated after COVID, when I used to read, and, you know, if it had just been on social media, I would probably never have seen it or bothered about it, but it started to break out, and, you know, people I knew were being asked, oh, you know, is this true? And, you know, there were times I would read this stuff and think, my God, this, like, fake life is much more glamorous and seems much more interesting than the one I'm actually living. So I don't know why that came about. I think, and this is why I wanted to address it in the book, there's no doubt that for some people, and this is a minority of people, but we're living in a time where people feel more able to say things like this. For some people, gay, lesbian are slurs. They are, you know, pejorative. So I think for some people it was just a way of, you know, having a go at me or being nasty to me. And I wanted to say in the book that, you know, the rumours annoyed me at times because they were untrue. People were telling lies about me. But I wasn't offended by them because they were about sexuality. That's, you know, and making the point from that, you know, it is how I see the world. Sexuality is not binary. And it would have been disingenuous to say that about other people and not include myself. But the other reason and this applies to the whole book, but particularly to this bit, my life, and I'm not complaining about this, I've been voluntarily a public figure for a long time. My life is talked about, you know, by lots of people, by the media all the time. So I wanted to put it in my own words. But it's also, for me, the book's a bit of a drawing a line in the sand. It's, you know, here's my life in my own words, the, you know, incredible sort of period in politics that I've been privileged to be part of. But from now on, I'm not naive and thinking that I can go and live entirely anonymously. But from now on, I'm going to redraw the boundaries a little bit between private and public, and reclaim a bit of a private life. And what I'm basically saying, you know, particularly to sections of the media in Scotland, if you think you're going to get a running commentary from now on relationships I'm in, who they're with or whatever, then you're sadly mistaken, because that's private, and it's my private life, and it's going to be private.
Yeah, and that awkwardly brings on to a personal question that I wanted to ask you. I'm sure you've seen those popular left-wing T-shirts that say, never kissed a Tory. I wanted to ask you whether you've ever kissed a unionist.
That's private.
Fair enough. There was a lot of focus on your tears at the COVID inquiry. I wanted to ask you about this because it's interesting. In recent weeks, there's been a similar focus on Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner, who've also cried publicly, and a debate about whether it's a sign of weakness or strength. And I wonder what your reflections on it are. When you've seen clips of Rachel Reeves, for example, crying in the House of Commons, how do you feel? Do you reflect on your own time when you were seen crying in public?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should want, you know, a kind of reality where senior politicians burst into tears all the time, right? So I'm not advocating that, but I don't think we should see a bit of emotion as a sign of weakness, because it's not. You know, most people cry, most people try to do it in private, but people will react emotionally when they're under stress, and I don't think we should see that as a sign of weakness. And because women tend to, you know, do it a bit more than men, who, you know, will more so try to sort of keep everything, then the danger is it becomes associated with women, and women are weak and all the rest of it. And that's nonsense. I think we should all be a little bit more open about emotion, about mental health, about, you know, stress and how to deal with stress. And So Rachel Reeves or Angela Rayner, it's a human reaction sometimes to shed a tear when you're under intense pressure and stress. And I think we should actually see it as just normal and definitely not a sign of weakness.
Yeah. I mean, the former Scotland Secretary, Alistair Jack, said, I didn't believe it for a minute she could cry from one eye if she wanted to. So it struck me as sort of there's no way of winning.
Do you know what? I mean, Alistair Jack, who cares, to be honest? I mean, I genuinely think I would struggle to care less about the opinion of Alistair Jack than I do. But do you know what? I think these comments, they say more about him than they say about me. So, yeah, maybe he should spend a bit more time, I don't know, crying or, getting a bit more comfortable with his own emotions. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And just lastly, you said last month you were considering moving to London. I wonder if...
I think this has been slightly overblown.
Right, okay.
I say this,
record.
Mum, I'm not moving out of Scotland for good. Look, I am never... I'm not going to correct the record because it's not entirely untrue, but it's been a bit overblown.
Okay.
Scotland is my home. It's where I belong. It's where I feel happiest and most comfortable, and it's, I care about it deeply. I care about its present, its future, and so I'm never going to be long out of Scotland. But I might spend a bit of time out of Scotland over the next few years, mainly because I've never lived outside of Scotland before because I've been doing what I've been doing, and I think it's actually quite healthy to have some time where you see your own country from the outside. I'm not complaining about this, but there's obviously still, even a couple of years after standing down, a lot of scrutiny of me in Scotland. There's a lot of, and it's great. I love the fact that I talk to people in the street that I would never otherwise get to talk to. But it can be, so being outside of Scotland for a little while might give me more of a chance to kind of move into the next phase of my life a bit more, freely. London, this. What amuses me is I say this and people react as if, oh my God, how can you support Scottish independence? How can you possibly love London? I really love London. I always have. I mean, during the tube strike, it's stretching the patience a little bit, but I really love this city and I love spending time here. I feel a bit, more anonymous than I do in Scotland. So yeah, spending more time here is definitely on the agenda, but maybe other places as well.
Yeah. What's your favourite part of London?
I love Soho. I actually, the bit I really love just now is the bit around King's Cross, the kind of redevelopment at King's Cross. I was there with a friend last night, and it just reminded, it's just an amazing, so vibrant. So yeah, there's lots of places in London I love. So I may be here a bit more often, but I'll always find my way home.
Thank you so much, Nicola Sturgeon.
You.
Thanks for joining us on the New Statesman podcast.
You.